Now, Psalm 78, while it is a psalm of Asaph, is more phrased as if it's God speaking to his people. So it's kind of coming from God's perspective to his people, basically, encouraging them to follow him, to remember the great things he's done, and what he can do to help them out in their life. So some fun things we get to learn. All right, so verse 1, give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. So that's, if you incline your ear, you're leaning into somebody, you're turning your ear towards them, you are focusing on them. So we are to focus on the words of God's mouth, the scriptures, the things he's telling the prophets, the revelations that we're getting, things like that. Verse 2, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. So verse 4 is kind of a negative one a little bit, but what it's really saying is it is important that we teach the rising generation the commandments of God. Teach them the scriptures, teach them what he has done in the past, help them understand and know God. Verse 5, for he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. So this is, again, continues on. The parents' job is to teach the gospel to their children. The more the parents can teach their gospel to their children and live the gospel, be an example to their children of living the gospel, then they'll teach it to their children, and it continues on down the line. This is kind of a patriarchal order, if you will. But it's important that we are doing this generation after generation. Let's see, verse 6, that the generation might come to know them, even the children which should be born, which should arise to declare to them their children. Verse 7, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. So remember, Israel had that group that wouldn't go into the promised land, that wouldn't follow the commandments of God. They were stubborn, they wouldn't do what God said. So God said, okay, that generation is going to be gone. We need a new generation who understands the gospel and raise the new generation up. And then that generation is to help the next generation continue to raise and move forward. This is important even in church today. Verse 9, the children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. Now, that's not good. If you have your archers leaving you, that's not good. That's disloyalty. There's some challenges in there. Verse 10, they kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, and forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zon. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters to stand as an heap. In the daytime also he led them with a cloud, and the night with a light of fire. He clave the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink as out of the great depths. He brought streams also out of the rock, and caused waters to run down like rivers. And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. They tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Now, this is reviewing the children of Israel's experience with Moses. They complained, they were hungry, so he gave them miracle food, manna. They complained they were thirsty, so he gave them a spring to get water from that came out of practically nowhere. They complained about all these problems and challenges, and God blessed them and helped them out. And yet they were still wicked. They still wanted to enjoy their lusts and not do what God wanted. So a lot of challenges they ran into. Verse 19, yea, they spake against God. They said, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Behold, he smote the rock that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide flesh for his people? So again, this is that temptation of, well, God has helped us in the past, but I don't know if he can help us in the future. It's a lack of faith right there. Verse 21, therefore the Lord heard this and was wroth. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel, because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation. They were always looking for a sign. They wanted something done for them. They didn't want to build their own faith. That's why they rebelled even against Moses with the golden calf and things. Is they didn't believe the golden calf was God. They believed the golden calf was a representation of God. So they'd pray to the calf, and the calf would transmit their prayers to God. They wanted someone to be in between them and God because they didn't believe fully in God. That's why they wanted Moses to help them. Moses wanted them to come into the presence of God so they could receive revelation and those things too. But they wouldn't. They needed a crutch. They needed someone to be in between them, and that's where the prophet comes in. When we, as a whole community, can focus on understanding God ourselves, then we don't necessarily need a prophet if we can communicate directly with God, which is ultimately what he wants. Prophets are a crutch to an extent. And I say that kind of loosely as well. They're still valuable and very important. But until we as a people learn to commune with God directly, we're going to need extra help. Once we can commune with God personally and we can work with him, the Spirit can teach us, we don't need a prophet quite as much, basically, because God will speak directly to us. So very important for us to understand. Let's see. Verse 23, though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven and had rained down manna upon them to eat and had given them of the corn of heaven, man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. He caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He rained flesh up also upon them as dust, and feathered fowls like as the sand of the sea. If you remember, that was the birds that came in, the doves that came in, brought them in with wind, brought them in from the ocean and other places, and they just had not doves, but quail, that they could eat and enjoy. They had food God miraculously provided for them because they really struggled with their faith. Let's see, and he let it fall in the midst of their camp round about their habitation, so they did eat and were filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while their meat was yet in their mouth, the wrath of God came upon them, and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still, and believed not for his wondrous works. Therefore their days did he consume in vanity, and their years in trouble. So this is the challenge, is God blesses them, they still sin. God punishes them for their sin, they still sin. They're not learning either direction, which is not a good thing. So verse 34, when he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God, and they remembered that God was their rock and the high God their Redeemer. So when they were dying off, then they realized that we need to talk to God and work with him. Verse 36, nevertheless, they did flatter him with their mouth, they lied unto him with their tongues. For their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again. So he realized they're human, they're frail, they're imperfect. Their lives are but seconds in time. So he didn't fully punish the people or use his wrath against them, basically, but sought to work with them and love them and forgave them. This is like, again, culminating together the whole point of the Old Testament. Understanding the love God has for his people and the patience he has for his people too. Verse 40, how oft did they provoke him in the wilderness and grieve him in the desert? Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy. How he had wrought his signs in Egypt and his wonders in the field of Zon, and had turned their rivers into blood and their floods that they could not drink. He sent divers sorts of flies among them, which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. Remember, these are the plagues, some of the plagues of Egypt. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labor unto the locust. For he destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, by sending evil angels among them. He made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. And smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength, in the tabernacles of Ham. But made his own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them on safely, so that they feared not. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to the border of his sanctuary, even to this mountain, which his right hand had purchased. So this is a quick, Cliff Note summary of this whole story of Moses and the children of Israel and the exile and things that were happening. But again, is to point out all the things that God did to bless his people. Even though they were wicked, they rebelled against him, they were constantly griping, complaining against God, he still loved them and took care of them. Man, if God can deal with these Israelites, he can deal with you and I. We're nowhere near as bad as how crazy these people got. So that's a good thing for us, that God still has patience for us and can help us. Let's see, verse 55, he cast out the heathen also before them, and divided them an inheritance by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. So he brought them into a land of abundance, God's sanctuary. He put them here. He got rid of the other people out of here for them, made it easier for them to come in for the most part, and help them out. Again, more of God's blessings for them. Yet, verse 56, they tempted and provoked the Most High God, and kept not his testimonies, but turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him to anger with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images, aka idol worship. They're worshiping the wrong gods. Verse 59, when God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awaked as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouteth by reason of wine. And he smote his enemies in the hinder parts, and he put them to a perpetual reproach. Moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph, and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth which he hath established forever. He chose David also his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. So this is really acknowledging the hand of God and what happened with Israel, the great things that they did, how Judah was picked. Judah's not the firstborn. Judah shouldn't get a birthright to rule, but they did. Joseph, who technically would have been the firstborn and he was the most righteous, would have gotten it, and then his oldest Ephraim would have gotten it as well, but God picked Judah because he loved Judah, because Judah stood up for Joseph. Remember, go back to that story. So that was part of the blessing that Judah got, was his lineage would be the kings, and the Savior would come through his lineage. So that's what they're talking about here, basically, how much God blessed the people. This is another one of those chapters in the Bible that really summarize the whole point of the Old Testament, which is to teach us that God loves us and he wants the best for us, and he's there to help us. We have to be willing to give up our rebellion. We have to be willing to be obedient and follow what God says. And if we focus on that, then he can bless us more and help us in our life. So thanks for watching. Hope you guys are enjoying these videos as well. Please share them, like, comment on them as well. Love to hear your thoughts and ideas of these Psalms as we go through them. And thank you for the comments you've left previously as well. We appreciate those. We love the conversation in the comments with you. And let's jump over to the next psalm as we continue to learn more.